The gymnasium of a high school in Tidewater, Virginia, was packed for the Veterans Day assembly, the bleachers full and the band done playing, when a guest speaker in a crisp officer's uniform made the entire room laugh at a quiet 15-year-old boy. The boy was Mateo Vega, and all he had done was answer a question honestly, that his mother had served, that she'd been a SEAL, the way he'd always understood it, and the lieutenant at the podium had smiled the thin smile of a man who enjoys correcting people and said, into the microphone, that there had never been a female SEAL and there never would be, and that somebody had been telling this young man stories. The gym laughed. Mateo did not argue. He said one quiet thing that almost no one heard right, and he sat back down with his face burning. What none of them knew, what the lieutenant least of all knew, was that out in the cold November parking lot, a woman was lowering the ramp of a long trailer, and behind her, sitting in silent ranks in the pale sun, were 40 war dogs. What happened when Mara Vega marched those 40 dogs through the gymnasium doors would silence a lieutenant mid-sentence, break a whole room wide open, and teach an entire town what the quiet woman on the county road had really been. Stay with me to the end of this one, and if you're new to this channel, go ahead and subscribe now because this is the kind of story we tell, and you'll want to be here for what comes next. To understand the woman in the parking lot, you have to understand a part of the war that almost nobody talks about. Mara Vega had not been a SEAL. Her son's word, offered in a boy's fierce pride, wasn't quite the right one. And it didn't matter because the truth was in some ways harder. Mara had been one of the handlers who trained and deployed the dogs that went out the door first, ahead of the most elite units this country has, into the rooms and the tunnels and the dark where men sent dogs, because dogs had a better chance of coming back. She had spent her war at the very tip of the spear with a multi-purpose canine on a lead, and she had the scars to prove it, the ones you could see and the ones you couldn't. She had sent her dogs into places that took some of them and brought others back, changed, and she had held more than one of them while it died. And she had learned the thing that the lieutenant at that podium had never had to learn, that a war dog is not equipment, whatever the paperwork says, but a soldier with 4 legs and a heart bigger than the men it serves. She had come home from all of it with a body that ached when the weather turned and a mind that did not always let her rest. There were nights she came awake in the dark certain she could hear them. Not the gunfire, not the explosions, but the dogs, the specific individual sounds of dogs she had loved and lost, and the men who'd gone down beside them. And her son had learned, young, to recognize those nights and to sit quietly outside her door, with one of the dogs until the morning came. That was what Mateo had meant in the gym, the quiet, true thing nobody heard right. He hadn't been bragging about a hero. He'd been telling them, the only way he knew how, that his mother was a person who carried the dead, and that it was nothing to laugh at. And she had learned something else, the thing that had ended up shaping the rest of her life. When the war wound down and the dogs got old, the system that had used them did not always know what to do with them. Some were adopted by their handlers, but some, the ones whose handlers were gone or couldn't be found, the ones labeled too damaged or too dangerous or simply too much trouble, ended up in kennels waiting on a decision nobody wanted to make. Mara Vega could not abide it. She had not left a man or a dog behind in combat, and she was not about to start at home. So she had taken her separation pay and a piece of rural land an hour inland, and she had built a sanctuary, and she had spent the years since collecting the discarded warriors of America's wars, 40 of them now, retired military working dogs, each one with a name and a record and a stretch of nightmares of its own. Have you ever had to watch someone you love be underestimated by people who had no idea who they really were? Tell me about them in the comments below. I read every one. The ones the world overlooks are exactly who this channel exists to honor. The oldest of her 40 was a grizzled Belgian Malinois named Zeke. Gray to the eyes now, slow in the hips with an old scar that ran the length of one shoulder. Zeke had been one of Mara's dogs years ago, loaned out on a rotation to whatever unit needed him, and he had a record longer than most men's. He slept in Mara's house now instead of the kennels, because he had earned it, and because the two of them understood each other in the way that only those who have been to the same terrible places together can. Then there was Marvin, who was not a dog but an old man, 79, a Vietnam veteran who had shown up at the sanctuary one morning and never really left. Marvin had been a scout dog handler in 1969 and 1970, and he carried a grief that Mara recognized the instant she met him, because Marvin had been there at the end. In 1973, when the United States pulled out of Vietnam and classified its war dogs as surplus equipment and left almost all of them behind, thousands of dogs that had walked point and saved countless American lives abandoned to a fate their handlers were never allowed to speak of. Marvin had spent 50 years carrying the dog he'd had to leave. He volunteered at Mara's sanctuary because it was, he said, the only place his particular ghost ever got quiet. And the two of them, the old handler and the young one, had become a kind of family, bound by the same unbearable knowledge and the same refusal to ever let it happen again. And there was Mateo, 15, quiet, the kind of boy who got overlooked at school and picked on a little, who had grown up in a house with 40 dogs and a mother who sometimes woke in the night with her hands shaking. He did not have a normal mom, and he knew it, and he would not have traded her for anything on earth. He had stopped trying years ago to explain to other kids what she'd done, because the explaining always came out wrong, and the proof was all classified or four-legged. So when the lieutenant at the podium mocked him in front of the whole school, Mateo did the thing he always did, which was to absorb it. And the one quiet thing he said, that almost no one heard, was the truest thing said in that gymnasium all day. The lieutenant was named Derek Coyle, and he was not a fraud. That was the thing that made it worse. He was a real combat officer with real deployments behind him, and he had come to that assembly to recruit and to be admired. And he had the particular hardness of a man who has seen things and decided that the way to survive them is to be harder than they are. He had no patience for what he called support roles, no use for the idea that anyone but a trigger puller was a real warrior, and a special and unexamined contempt for the notion of women anywhere near his world. None of that was the real reason he mocked the quiet kid, though Coyle himself didn't know it. The real reason was buried under 15 years and a wall he'd built so he'd never have to look at it. When Coyle's thin smile spread across his face and he told the gym that nobody's mama had ever been a SEAL, and the laughter rolled up the bleachers, Mateo Vega stood up. He didn't shout. He wasn't a shouter. He looked at the man in the uniform, and he said it plain, into the sudden quiet. She still hears the ones that died. If you had been sitting in that gym, watching a man in uniform humiliate a quiet kid for being proud of his mother, would you have said something, or would you have stayed in your seat like everyone else did? Be honest with yourself. Type "spoke up" or stayed silent in the comments below. I read every one. The lieutenant didn't understand it. Most of the room didn't. They heard a strange, sad sentence from an odd kid, and they shifted in their seats. And Coyle, recovering, made some remark about kids these days, and turned back to his notes. He had no idea what the boy meant. He had no idea that the boy lived with a woman who woke some nights hearing the specific individual cries of dogs that had died in her arms in places that don't appear on maps, and the men who died beside them. He had no idea that the boy's quiet sentence was not a boast, but a wound. And he had no idea that the side door at the far end of the gym had just opened, and that the cold November air was coming in, and that something was about to walk through it that would unmake every certainty Derek Coyle had built his armor out of. Because Mara Vega had been invited to that assembly weeks before by a guidance counselor who knew what she did and had asked her to bring some of the dogs for a demonstration, to show the kids what these animals were and what they'd given. She had been running late, unloading in the lot, when a teacher came out white-faced and told her what was happening to her son inside. And Mara Vega, who did not rattle, who had walked dogs into rooms full of armed men, simply finished lowering the ramp and clipped a lead onto old Zeke and gave a single quiet command and walked. She came through the gymnasium doors and down the center of the floor, and behind her, 2 by 2, in absolute silence, came 40 war dogs. They did not bark. They did not strain against their leads. They moved in a discipline that no one in that gym had ever witnessed in their lives. 40 retired warriors in perfect formation behind one small woman in a plain canvas coat. German Shepherds and Belgian Malinois and a few broad-headed Labradors, gray-muzzled most of them, scarred a lot of them, missing a leg here and an eye there, every one of them carrying itself with the bearing of a soldier on parade. 1,000 teenagers who had been laughing an hour before sat with their mouths open. The band director put his hand over his heart without deciding to. And at the center of the floor, Mara Vega stopped and turned and raised one hand, and 40 war dogs sat as one, a single soft sound of 40 bodies folding down at once, and then nothing. The gymnasium went completely silent. You could hear the flags moving in the draft from the open door, and the buzz of the lights, and 1,000 people forgetting to breathe. It was not a performance, and it did not feel like one. It felt like being in the presence of something that had been to the far edge of human experience and come back and was now sitting quietly on a basketball court in Virginia, waiting on one woman's word. Mara Vega did not look at the bleachers. She looked at the lieutenant, and when she spoke, her voice was low and level and carried to every corner of that silent room. The voice of someone who had given commands that meant life or death and never once needed to raise it. She introduced herself, and she said what she was. Not a SEAL, she said her son had the word wrong. And it didn't matter, because what she had been was the handler who sent these dogs through the door ahead of the SEALs, and the Rangers, and the men whose names this country isn't allowed to know, so that those men would have a few more seconds to live. She said the dogs sitting on that floor had 11 combat deployments and 4 Purple Hearts worth of equivalent between them, that they had found the bombs and cleared the rooms and pulled the wounded, and that every one of them had been thrown away by the country they served until she took them in. And then she said the thing that turned Derek Coyle to stone. She said that one of these dogs had been on a rooftop in a city she wouldn't name, on a night in the spring 15 years ago when an army unit got pinned down in the open and should not have made it out, and that the dog had found the way through the dark that the men couldn't, and led them out, and gone back for the last 2 who were down. She said it had cost the dog the shoulder that was scarred now. And she asked, into the silence, whether anyone in the room happened to remember a night like that. In the front bleacher, Lieutenant Derek Coyle had gone the color of ash. He had been a sergeant then. He had been one of the last 2 down. He had spent 15 years not talking about the night his unit got caught in the open on a rooftop with no way out. The night the radio failed and the air support was 20 minutes that might as well have been a year. The night he watched 2 of his men die and was certain he was about to be the 3rd. He remembered. The way you remember the worst night of your life, a shape coming through the dark that he'd thought at first was the enemy, and then realizing it was a dog, and the dog finding the stairwell that wasn't covered, and the dog going back into the fire for the 2 who couldn't walk. And he remembered being dragged by his vest down those stairs by hands he never saw clearly. He had never met the handler. In the compartment at Need to Know Dark of that war, he had never known her name, never known it was a her at all, and afterward the hard thing he'd built himself into had no room for a debt that big to something he'd been raised to think of as beneath a real soldier. So he had buried it. He had buried the grief for his 2 men and the shame of being saved, and the whole unbearable weight of owing his life to a dog and the stranger on the other end of its lead. And he had built 15 years of contempt on top of the grave, and he had walked into a high school gym and spat that contempt at a 15-year-old boy. And then old Zeke, who had been sitting at Mara's side through all of it, lifted his gray muzzle, and his nose worked, and something 15 years old and buried surfaced in the old dog the way it had surfaced in the man. Zeke rose, slow on his bad shoulder, and he crossed the gymnasium floor without a command, straight to the front bleacher, and he put his scarred head against the knee of the lieutenant who had mocked the boy an hour before, and he held it there, and his tail moved once. The dog remembered of all the people in all the rooms and all the years, the dog remembered the man he had gone back for. Derek Coyle looked down at the animal that had carried him out of the worst night of his life, and the hard man came apart in front of 1,000 people. And he slid down off that bleacher onto his knees and put both his hands in that gray fur and pressed his face against the old dog's neck, and he wept, and he could not say a word. He had gone silent, exactly as the title of this story promised, but not in the way anyone had expected. He had gone silent the way a man goes silent when he is finally 15 years too late, made to feel the size of what he owes. What happened after moved through that Tidewater town the slow, certain way the truth moves, in the diner and the chapel on the base, and the parking lot after church. The story of the Veterans Day Assembly went everywhere, and the quiet boy who had been laughed at became overnight the most envied kid in the school, the one whose mom had marched 40 war dogs into the gym. The lieutenant did a thing that took more courage than the uniform. He came back the next week and stood in front of that same assembly and told them the whole truth, that the boy had been right and he had been wrong, that he was alive because of one of those dogs and one of those handlers, and that he had spent 15 years too proud to honor it, and that he was done being that man. He became, in the months after, the loudest advocate the sanctuary ever had. There are turns in a life that feel less like coincidence than like arrangement. That the one officer who mocked her was the one man in that gym whose life her dog had saved, brought face to face at last with the debt he'd run from. A person does not have to know the word for it to feel it settle in the chest. The sanctuary, which had run for years on Mara's savings and Marvin's Social Security and not much else, did not want for help after that. The town adopted it. People drove out on weekends to walk the old dogs and to sit with Marvin while he told them, finally, about the dog he'd had to leave behind in 1973. A story he'd carried alone for 50 years and could at last set down among people who understood. A local veterans group started a fund so that no retired war dog in that part of Virginia would ever again wait in a kennel on a decision nobody wanted to make. And Derek Coyle adopted old Zeke with Mara's blessing, and the dog that had saved his life got to spend its last good years sleeping at the foot of the bed of the man it had carried out of the dark, which is the only kind of ending a dog like that should ever get. And Mateo Vega walked a little taller, not because the school finally believed him, though they did, but because he had stood up in front of 1,000 people and a man in a uniform and told the truth about his mother when it would have been so much easier to sit down and disappear, the way he always had. His mom told him that night, at the kitchen table with dogs asleep all over the floor, that standing up like that, alone, when you're outnumbered and outranked and scared, was the bravest kind of thing a person could do. Braver than anything the dogs or she had ever done downrange. And that she had never in her life been prouder. On most evenings now, there is a woman on the porch of a sanctuary out on a county road when the sun goes down and a quiet boy beside her doing his homework, and an old Vietnam handler in the next chair finally at peace, and 40 war dogs settling into the dark of the kennels behind them. Every one of them home, every one of them safe. Not one of them ever to be left behind again. What Mara Vega did was not extraordinary in the way we usually mean the word. She loaded a trailer, and she answered a teacher's white face, and she walked her dogs into her room because her son needed her to. She did not raise her voice or settle a single score. She simply let the truth walk in on 40 silent sets of paws and stand in the middle of the floor, and the truth did what the truth does, which is to make the proud quiet in the overlooked scene. The lieutenant had mocked the boy for being proud of a warrior. He had not understood that he was looking the whole time at the family of the dog he owed his life to. This story is for every warrior the world refused to recognize. The women, the handlers, and the four-legged soldiers who went through the door first and were never thanked. And for every kid who stood up alone and told the truth anyway. Did you know America once classified its war dogs as equipment and left them behind? Or do you know a veteran of any kind with 2 legs or 4 whose service the world never properly saw? Put their name in the comments below. Let's fill this section with the ones who deserve to finally be recognized. Every story on this channel is about the overlooked, the underestimated, and the ones who refuse to leave anybody behind. If that means something to you, subscribe so you're here for the next one. There are more of these stories to tell. And before you go, which moment in this one stayed with you the most? I'll see you in the comments.